Okay, Good afternoon, everyone. So we'll look at Anybus X-gateway, which is a good old faithful in terms of product ranges for HMS. So is it moving? I don't seem to have control just yet. Right. There we go. So Anybus X-gateway, what is it? Anybus X-gateway has a simple function in life. It is a protocol translator. And if you'll see from the slides later on that it's generally an on-demand product. So a system integrator has got to add a machine to an existing factory. The existing factory is all Ethernet IP, and they've bought a machine that speaks Modbus or PROFIBUS or something else. So they just need a simple way of mapping the data across. The X-gateway doesn't process the data. So what goes in gets just directly translated and presented on the other side. So if let's say you had a couple of bytes of data and they were byte swapped, then they would appear on the other side byte swapped. So there's no processing involved. You don't set it up to manipulate the data. It's very straightforward to use. If you have a PLC on one side and a bunch of slave devices on the other side, that's easy to configure. If it's a PLC on both sides, that's very easy because all you can do is set the station address on both sides and the PLCs do the rest. So the X-gateway doesn't request data from anything. Data arrives from the PLC on side one, it translates it and makes it available to the PLC on side two. And that's the other thing is the X-gateway does not push data out on the other network, it just makes it available. So the PLC on the other side will have to come and collect it, because that's often a misunderstanding with the X-gateway. Now it supports every protocol we support. It uses the same technology inside as our embedded technology, and it's common technology for us, so we're very experienced in it. So here's the solution. Here we've got network one. Never remember which one's in this. Okay, so we've got CC link on one side. We want to go to Ethernet IP on the other. So the Ethernet IP side is an adapter, so that's the slave side. Another area that people often get confused over is what they should select the X-gateway to be. Now, PLCs are always masters. So if you have a PLC one side and a PLC the other side, the X-gateway is going to be a slave on both sides. And that's the important thing to remember. If it's a PLC on that top side, let's say we had a Mitsubishi PLC on that CC link side, so we'd be a slave to that PLC, but we had some sub devices like some Ethernet IP drives on the other side, then we would be a scanner or a master on that sub side, because we would have to control the communications between those slave devices because there's no PLC to do it. Okay, why bother? Let's have a look. So as I mentioned, and Bill mentioned as well, there is a wide range of protocols around, because in most manufacturers' dream worlds, you would buy everything from them, the PLCs, the drives, everything. So it's in their interest to have their dedicated protocol, and some would argue they also think they know best too. But it is something that hasn't harmonized. There's been several attempts over the years to come up with a common protocol, and every single time it's come to nothing, because there's nothing commercially in it for these manufacturers to do that. So that's where the X-gateway comes in. It means that there's no programming involved. You've got a solution to get differing networks to talk to each other. Now we have a quick configuration software, but generally speaking, if you are operating, as I mentioned, a slave-slave X-gateway, essentially you just set the slave addresses and stand back, and that's all you can do. If you're setting up masters, you might have to use this software. It's a USB connection into the front of the X-gateway, and you can set up the various sides of the X-gateway, but most people don't have to do that. So let's have a look at some use cases. Oh, just before I go off from the programming, if you've got an Ethernet-based X-gateway, you can also access a web server on board the X-gateway and do configurations from there. So if you were working with Ethernet IP, for instance, you would go in and set up the scan list for the Ethernet IP side of things. You do that directly on the website, on the web server of the X-gateway. Now, there's a lot of these use cases here, so I won't bore you by going through in detail on them all. But if we take a look at a few here, you can see we've got a Profinet IoT control network on the top with a PLC. We have another machine on the bottom network with a PLC. So you might think, well, why would you want an X-gateway? Because you're going PROFINET to PROFINET. But in this case, they want to decouple the networks. So if something horrible happens on the network for machine A, the X-gateway becomes the sacrificial lamb for that and protects the upper network. So you're just decoupling the two networks on there. As it says, you've got up to 220 bytes of input data, 220 bytes of output data. It does vary based on what the protocol supports. Also, it's worth noting that we stick to the standard connectors. So whatever the standard for PROFINET, or, well, that's an Ethernet protocol, but some of the serial protocols, whatever connectors they demand, we use the standard connector. As it says on there, you've got web functions for dynamic web pages. Email, FTP is supported on there. Okay, this is a more typical protocol conversion. So here we have PROFINET on one side of the network with the Siemens PLC. We have a Mitsubishi PLC on the other side. So we have two masters there and two different protocols. So the X-gateway is going to be a slave to both. So it's a slave to the PROFINET, it's a slave to the CC link. All it will do is pass however much data it's given by each PLC, it will convert it and pass it over to the other side. And you can do things like set status bytes. So for instance, you can tell the PLC can constantly scan that status and see when there's new data waiting for it. So in this case, we can see we've got up to 512 bytes input data and 512 bytes of output data. So it does act as a decoupler as well, but more importantly than this, it is acting as a protocol converter. Here we have the same thing again. That's why I'm not going to dwell too much on these, because they're all similar things. They're all ice cream of different flavors, if you like. So here we have Ethernet IP to DeviceNet. It's the same thing again. We're a DeviceNet adapter because we have a DeviceNet PLC, and we're an Ethernet IP adapter on the top end because we have an Ethernet IP adapter. Oh, I appear to have lost control. Oh, here we go. You have to bear with me, everybody, because I can't see the little icons anymore on the. Oh, they've just come back again. Okay, so let's go back a bit more. Right. So here we are. This scenario is a decoupling. So again, as I say, it's a bit of a repeat here. So we've got PROFIBUS on both sides. It's just really illustrating that the same applies on serial-based protocols here, but we're just using it as a decoupling between two sets of machines and two networks on here. And the last one on here. So the problem is integrating existing machine installation at the device hub using PROFIBUS to PROFINET. So here we're going from a serial protocol through to an Ethernet protocol. So let's have a look at some case studies. So in this case, we've got SVIA. They're a Swedish robot cell manufacturer. As it says, their software pick vision identifies what the robot should pick up from a conveyor belt. Now they use ABB robots, which are supporting DeviceNet, but of course they can't specify to end users what they're going to use. So in this case, they use the X-gateway to provide any network the customer wants. And it's for them a sales benefit because they're reducing any possible issues over compatibility with the customer. It's removing any blockages to getting the order because whatever the site network is, the answer is yes, yes, we can support that. But they're using it with a common piece of equipment that they're familiar with. So here we've got honing machines can connect to any network. Said in my best sales presenter voice. So this is Nagel Precision in the US, and they create honing machines predominantly for the automotive industry. So they're using Ethernet IP with Allen Bradley PLCs. Theirs is the same issue that selling into Europe, obviously PROFINET, PROFIBUS are huge. So they need that capability for selling into those markets, and they need to have no issues in terms of supporting their clients' requirements. So the X-gateway resolves that. So a quick look at the features and functionality. I guess this serves as a summary really to what I've already talked about. Now, one thing I didn't mention earlier and is on this slide is that it does support an OPC version. Now it's a server version and it's DA, so it's not OPC UA. I'm not aware if that's coming, and Siobhan's probably more up to date on what's in the pipeline for that side of things. So, but for local connectivity, if you wanted to use OPC, then the Anybus supports that. All of the Ethernet versions support that. So it easily connects machines and networks through. Oh, where's my mouse gone? It easily connects machines and networks, so you get consistent information. The easier way of explaining that is, it doesn't matter what network mix you get, you can support that on your machines. Okay, so fast, transparent data, transfer of I/O data between the machines. It's important to understand that, because we don't process the data. The reason I bang on about that is occasionally we've had customers over the years who, for instance, have connected. The one particular one I did when I was still out doing site work was from an Ethernet IP sensor, and they were insistent that the data was just not being read correctly. But actually what was happening is that the data was being sent byte and word swapped by this Ethernet IP device. So the X-gateway just sent it out to the Modbus side, byte swapped and word swapped. So they were expecting the X-gateway to have done some sort of manipulation on it, but it won't. It sends it out as it gets it. So 200 different network combinations: master, scanner, slave, adapter, I/O device, and server. We've mentioned this, it can be used for coupling and decoupling because it acts as a complete separation of the two networks. So if your robot had a hissy fit and sent 415 volts down the network, it's not going to get through the X-gateway. So it integrates field bus networks with industrial Ethernet networks. That's a common use for it. It does extend the physical distance when you're coupling two similar networks, so that can be quite handy. And it does reduce infrastructure costs. As it says, it can eliminate PLC or rack-mounted devices, but I find quite often one of the most useful things is if you are upgrading a factory, you've maybe taken out an old PLC, so you've got a bunch of drives that are still perfectly capable and perfectly functional, but they don't speak the same protocol as the PLC you now want to use. Well, for a few £100 with an X-gateway, you can keep those drives in service and get them talking to your PLC. It says designed for harsh industrial environments. They are in a robust metal housing, but they should be in a panel. They're IP20, so yes, it means if the installation engineer throws it on the floor, there's a very good chance it's going to survive. And as it says, provides instant connectivity. That's under certain circumstances. It doesn't require programming if it's slave-slave, just to remind you of that. Okay, quick tour. Again, this is a lot of data, so I won't bore you with all of it on here because you'll have copies of the slide, but it is IP20. It's 24 volts DC, and as you can see there, it's 200 milliamps. It doesn't require a lot in the way of power. It will have whatever connectors are appropriate to the protocols on the top of the bottom, and you've got a USB configuration port on the front for its software. You can see on the left-hand side, with an audience familiar with PROFIBUS, you'll see the familiar PROFIBUS station switches on there. So if it's a slave-slave, then you would just select them. And if it was a slave-slave on an Ethernet side, say on the top side, you would have some little dip switches. So again, depending on what the IP range that the client wants to use, you could just physically set it. What do you get in the box? Well, you get a very spangly, shiny Anybus box. I like our packaging. I think it's pretty good. It protects the product really well. You get a USB cable. You get the USB plug, power connector, installation leaflet, and as it says, a serial cable for the PROFIBUS master configuration. You get whatever's appropriate to the protocol, essentially. Now, it says wide DIN clip for optional fitting. So you might think, well, why would you want to optionally fit it? The old X-gateway, if you look at that picture on the right there, that is a sort of typical module format. But if you imagine that mounted sideways on, that is the profile of the old X-gateway. And we have a lot of applications, for instance, marine and military applications, where if they want a replacement, there is no possibility of reconfiguring anything or recabling anything. So what it means is you can mount the DIN rail on the side of the X-gateway. You can almost pick out the screw holes on that image and mount it directly into where the old style X-gateway went. Now, okay, you can't see the LEDs, which is slightly inconvenient, but the fact is they don't generally care. They just want to get out the old one, set the switches to match the old one on the new one, plug it in and work, and it does. So it's got a good backward compatibility physically and technically.